So let's move forward now to the 1200s, into the 13th century. And I'd like to introduce you to a well-known family from Venice of that time. We know them particularly for the rather excellent mint with the hole that we've enjoyed for so many years. Pardon?
Marco mint.
That's the ones, Marco mints. I'll ask this young man here, do you still eat polo mints? You've never eaten them, you don't know what you see, times change. So even the polo mint's gone out of fashion. But of course it isn't the polo mint people I'm talking about. As the gentleman has already said, we're talking about the Polo family. Now, Marco is the person we're most familiar with, but it wasn't Marco who was really big in the business to begin with. It was his dad and his uncle. And his dad and his uncle, they were tradespeople. They were in the business of buying and selling goods. And they came up with the idea of increasing their business by going to China, meeting with the emperor, and doing, dare I say it, a trade deal. And then bringing silk thread back to Italy to be woven into cloth. So they set sail from Venice with Marco. Marco apparently was about 17 at the time. They set sail from Venice to the end of the Mediterranean, roughly where the Suez Canal is now, and they crossed over to the Red Sea, where their plan was to pick up an Arab ship and sail round Arabia, sail round India, and sail on to China. However, once they got to the Red Sea, they didn't like the look of the Arab sailing ships. They didn't look very seaworthy. So they were left with only one option, and that was to walk across Saudi Arabia, well, Arabia, wasn't Saudi Arabia, walk across Arabia, join the Silk Road, and walk their way to China. Now, in fact, apparently they did, and they met with the then emperor, Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, who had swept through the area and taken over control of much of what we know as China today. They got their audience with Kublai Khan and said, yeah, we'd like to do a deal. We'd like to buy silk, take it back to Italy. And he said, yeah, okay, yeah, no problem. I'd like to do a deal with you. I've just got two conditions. What are the conditions? And he said, well, first of all, I want you, next time you come, I want you to bring some of your Christian monks, because I'd like to learn more about this Christian religion that you people follow. So Marco's dad and uncle, no problem. We don't mind kidnapping a couple of monks and bringing them with us. Not a problem. We can do that. What's the second condition? The second condition, said Kublai Khan, is that your son Marco stays here with me. Again, Dad thought about it a couple of moments and went, yeah, no problem. Anything to get the deal. So Marco stayed in China. And Dad and his uncle took the silk thread back to Venice, and their business took off. And they did over a number of years, backwards and forwards trade. Marco apparently was very successful in supporting the family business from China and was there for a number of years. But then when he returned to Italy, to Venice, by that time, Venice and Lucca, on the other side of Italy, were engaged in a war. And as seafaring nations, a lot of their battles occurred at sea, even though they were on the opposite sides of the country. And during one of those sea battles, excuse me, Marco was captured and thrown into prison. And this is how we know most of what we know, in fact, nearly all of what we know about Marco Polo. Because while he was in prison, he met an author And Marco told his story of his time in China to the author. The author wrote it down and it was published. And that book is still available today, and it is still a primary source of the information we have. The bit I like is that a translation of the author's name was Rusty Cello. So I wonder if he was actually in prison for not being a very good musician. But anyway, now, as your historians, I will tell you this bit. Some other historians have come to the conclusion that Marco may never have been in China. It has been put forward that not so much by what he said, but the things that he left out of his story to Rusty Cello suggest that he maybe never went there, that what he was doing was telling the stories that his dad and his uncle had told him after their trip. We don't really know. And it's got nothing to do with silk anyway. But they contributed enormously to the wealth of the silk industry in Italy during their time. I'd now like to introduce you to another Italian who contributed to the wealth of, in this case, Lucca, in the 1400s. This gentleman is Giovanni Arnolfini. Now, we know a bit more about him than we do about Marco Polo. He was born in Lucca in 1400. In 1420, he was sent by his family from Lucca to Bruges to manage the family business in Northern Europe. He went and he was very successful. And among the things that they traded in was silk, undoubtedly. He was very successful, so successful that a few years later, in 1426, he was able to invite this lady, Constanza Trenta, who he had known since childhood in Lucca, to come to Bruges and join him and become his wife. So far, so good. It's quite likely that they'd been betrothed as children, so this was the natural course of things to happen. So what I have here is a reproduction of a painting that was painted by Jan van Eyck. It's known as The Marriage of Arnolfini, and it's intended, if you like, to be a marriage certificate. Because in those days, there wasn't the complex business of arranging a wedding that we have in this country today. They would have gone before the priest, their priest would have blessed them, and they would have been married. This picture gives us a lot of information, though. There's a lot to indicate the wealth. Certainly the way that Giovanni is dressed is very wealthy, albeit he is still a merchant rather than aristocracy, and he would never became part of the aristocracy in Bruges. His wife is wearing a voluminous dress. I think that's the right word, a huge dress. In fact, some students replicated this dress, and it was found to contain 39, I'm not sure, can't remember if it's yards or meters, but of material. So there was a huge amount of material in this dress. It used to be thought she was pregnant, but we think that was highly unlikely. One, they never had children. Well, that of course doesn't mean she wasn't pregnant, but, and I think this is the crucial question, if Giovanni Arnolfini had got his wife pregnant before they were married, would he, in 1420, have commissioned a well-known artist to paint such a picture? Surely it has slimmed her down a bit at least. So it's highly, highly unlikely. Also, they were very, very religious, as there are symbols in the picture that give us that clue. One candle, lit candle in the candelabra, the eye of God looking down on them. In the mirror, Jan van Eyck painted himself at his easel, a witness to what was going on. He wrote on the painting, Jan van Eyck was here, and he dated it 1434. Hang on. They were married in 1426. What's going on? Why did he wait till 1434? But there's something else. We know from documents that Constanza Trenta died in 1433. Dun, 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 dun. So what's going on? Why has he waited so long? Well, nobody knows. So I have come up with my own theory. And my theory is this, that he was so bereft at the death of his beloved Constanza, and there is a lot to indicate that they were deeply in love with one another from letters that were sent between them and backwards and forwards to Luca, that he wanted something to remember her by. So he commissioned the painting. But of course, there was no Constanza now to be in the painting, and Jan van Eyck would have needed a model. So in those days, females, to be a model for an artist, was usually a woman of low birth and, quite frankly, ill repute. So here would be a woman who would not have a good standing in the Bruges community, standing next to Jan van Eyck, to Giovanni Arnolfini, and he's got his left hand out holding her. Now, I'm told by art historians that the likeness for Constanza, Jan van Eyck would probably have got from miniatures that she would have had been painted elsewhere at other times of her. So he'd have been able to use those to build up her portrait, just the body for the model. But he should have been standing with his right hand across his body and holding her right hand. So I wonder, could he not quite bring himself to bring his right hand to hold her right hand and just sort of touched her with his left hand as part of his... I've no idea, but I love telling the story, even though it's got very little to do with silk. However, the important bit is we've got this very, very successful silk weaving industry taking place in Italy, and Italy has built a reputation by this time of outstanding silk wear, particularly heavyweight upholstery silk, and it's sold all over the world. Let's move across to the neighboring country of France. Again, now still in the 1400s, 1465, if I'm correct, if my memory serves, Louis XI, on the throne at the time, had been engaged in a number of wars which had depleted the French economy. He was looking to bring in income, and he noticed that in Italy, where they had a very successful silk weaving industry, and he decided that's the way forward for us in France. So he persuaded weavers from other parts of France, northern France in particular, to come to Lyon and Tours, set up their looms and weave silk. They would have traditionally been woolen or linen weavers, but now they could weave silk. And with some persuasion, they came and they did what he wanted. There was just one fly in the ointment at this stage. These weavers were not followers of Catholicism. They had become followers of this new Protestant religion that was emerging, and we know these people largely as Huguenots. They were known in France as Canuts. But Louis wasn't going to be put off by this. So he said, no, it's not a problem. You can come and I will give you permission to follow your faith the way that you want to, if you'll set up your looms and create me a fortune. And they did. And they became experts at producing lighter weight silks, ideal for clothing. So they were producing silk that wasn't in direct competition with Italy. So there was a great opening up of the market. There were still problems for Huguenots, and at several times there were several wars and massacres of Huguenots from then on, but they were successful in their weaving industry until 1685. By this time, Louis XIV was on the throne, and his advisors were saying, these Huguenots, these Canuts, have become too powerful. They've got to be stopped. They've got to be put in their place. So Louis XIV was persuaded that he would revoke what was known as the Edict of Nantes, which had given the Huguenots the authority and permission to celebrate their religion, and insisted now they became Roman Catholics. Their children were brought up as Roman Catholics. Everybody went to Roman Catholic churches, but worst of all, you cannot leave the country. They had to stay and weave. Well, it's estimated that about 200,000 Huguenots in France, gives you this idea of the size of the weaving industry, managed to escape France, with 50,000 of them getting in on ships and sailing across the Channel to Britain. Many of them apparently escaping in barrels of wine. I can think of worse ways to travel. Presumably the barrels were empty, however, when they were in them. But anyway, about 50,000 came across the Channel and made their way to London initially, where they set up their silk weaving looms in and around the area of Spitalfields. And if you're ever around that area, have a look at some of the street names, because they link back to very much to French names of that time. And guess what? Having got to Britain and setting up their looms, they became incredibly successful in Britain too. Now, I'll just pause there for a moment, because they were now totally reliant on the importation of silk thread. The conditions in Britain are totally wrong for producing mulberry trees that will produce the right kind of fruit that were needed for the silk. Henry VIII had tried, not done so well. I think Queen Elizabeth I also tried. King James I of Britain, 6th of Scotland, he decided that 100,000 mulberry trees would be planted in the grounds of Hampton Court. Not a single thread of silk was produced, because he chose the wrong mulberry. He chose to plant black mulberry, and the mulberry that the moths had been bred to eat, not the moths, sorry, the caterpillars had been bred to eat, is white mulberry. So he got it completely. However, even if he had, there was still the problem of how you get these conditions right. The climate's wrong. It's just wrong. In 1717, a man from Worcester called John Appleby came up with a brilliant idea of an enormous incubator for the eggs of the moths that would enable them to produce the silk. And he got people to invest in 1717, £1 million, equivalent roughly of £33 million today, to invest in his egg chest. Again, not a single thread of silk was produced. And try as I might, I have not been able to find out what happened to John Appleby after that. But anyway, moving on. So the conditions were wrong, but we tried. But now the silk industry had begun. By 1713, the silk industry, the silk weaving industry in Britain, had become so strong that the weavers lobbied Parliament and said, we want you to impose a ban on the trading of silk with France. That's a good way to get your own back, isn't it? So And they persuaded the then government to do exactly that. But of course, they didn't just put an embargo on silk goods. They stopped trade or banned trade with France pretty much altogether, all the key things that people wanted. Hence, the era of smuggling has begun. And those products, tobacco, brandy, etc., were being smuggled into Britain. But that's how powerful they'd become, how strong they become in a very short space of time. Silk weaving was then the third largest industry in Britain and remained so for quite some time. How am I doing for time? Okay, good.